Okay, so we're ready to prepare our paper. I've got two sheets here. One's actually prepared already. They're both handmade. This is a contemporary paper. This is a vintage paper, a vintage English paper. This paper right here, this is made in a paper mill in Indiana called Twin Rocker. Amazing paper that they've got here. This is called calligraphy cream, and I like that a lot. Specifically, it's laid, which means the paper has been, the cotton pulp has been put down onto a screen, a very fine screen, and it actually impresses an image onto the paper. And that's how paper was produced centuries ago. When it was first made, it was all laid like this. Not only in the 19th century you get that smoother wove paper, but so I prefer that. I like the texture of it. there's a bit of nostalgia there. I think I like the fact that does connect to all these great classic papers from the past. So this one has the watercolor tint on it already. I'm fairly free with the way I put the watercolor down. Sometimes it spatters a lot, even a lot more than this, but this worked out perfectly fine. But after you put the watercolor down, in order to use those pencils to give that look of Conte or natural red chalk, I feel the need to put a little extra sizing in the paper. And sizing is just glue. All paper has sizing in it to keep to modulate the absorbency of the paper. This paper right here, this old vintage paper, has rabbit skin glue as or animal hide glue as the binder. This modern paper has something different. I don't know exactly what it is, and it might actually be a secret recipe that they use, but it works just great. But I feel the need to add a little bit extra, an extra layer to make the surface just a bit more abrasive to grab those waxy pencils. Otherwise, they draw a little more like dull-colored pencils, and they really don't look all that rich. So the preparation that I used to use was the animal hide glue. I would just mix up a little bit more, just like the stuff that's in this paper right here, and spread it on. That's after I put watercolor on, by the way. I always put a little layer of watercolor, just because it looks attractive, and it gives a middle tone to the paper. So there we can go a little dark and towards the light, erase it away to create our lights, which we'll do in this drawing. And by adjusting the color from yellow to red to violet, you can get some just different, interesting effects on the paper. So immediately you've got something that looks good with the watercolor spread across the paper. But getting back to that preparation, I used to just put an extra layer of sizing made of animal hide glue. And that glue would allow me to layer and layer and layer those very thin pencils. But now I use something that's a little more accessible, a little easier to find. I think you don't have to cook it in order to prepare it, and that's shellac. Shellac has been around also for thousands of years. This is a bottle of shellac right here. And this shellac is what I'll be using as the sizing. And what I do is I take about 1 part of this shellac and about 5 parts of a solvent of shellac, which is either denatured alcohol or isopropyl alcohol, either one. I tend to use the isopropyl alcohol a little more. It just tends to be a little less, the fumes seem to be a little less intense. And when you do use it, either with isopropyl or the other alcohol, make sure you have it working in a ventilated area because the fumes can be very strong. Okay, so what I'll do, I'll just put a preparation on this paper, just the watercolor preparation, just so you can see how I spread it on. And it's pretty simple. Let's put this paper down here. I've already got a little mixture here of just some yellow and violet. I can make it a little more yellow by adding a little extra, of that cadmium yellow in there. And it's a neutral tone. There's the color of it right there. So we can make it redder or more yellow if we'd like, whatever appeals to you. And get a nice big brush so I can do this quickly. And also a big brush allows for a nice even tone. The smaller brush will give you almost hatch marks. And I just spread that on like that. You can see that animal hide glue really repelling. There's a lot of sizing in this paper. That's how I like it. Already, it's just great paper. That water beating up just shows that it's really impregnated with beautiful, a lot of sizing. And there's a little extra kind of streak of yellow. And we can even play a little bit with the way the kind of spatters on the edges. And this is kind of fun to do, and this is about as close to abstract painting as I ever get. But when I do this, I can almost see what Jackson Pollock and others, how they would enjoy doing this. Beyond paper preparation, doesn't excite me that much, but I can see that there's some enjoyment that artists and some satisfaction you can get out of this. And let's just throw in a few other spatters on the edges. And some of these pools that are in the middle, I'll just take the brush and even it out. That will absorb a little bit of the water and just lift it up. And we got a nice, nice paper just about ready to go. So I can draw on this right now. I can draw on it with the Conte, with the pastel, and even with those very thin pencils. But if I really want those very thin pencils to do what I want them to do, the next step would be mixing up the 1 to 5 mixture of shellac, spreading that on after this dries, and then we're ready to go. Hi, I'm Rob Liberace, and today I'd like to take a look at really the figure in action, the dynamic figure rendered in black chalk. Now, one of the great hallmarks of great master drawing is their energetic, intense, spirited types of drawing. And the drawing that I'd like to do today is very much in that same spirit. We've got a tremendous model, Wayne, and we're going to try to create or evoke some of that tremendous dynamism of master drawing today with our rendering. Now, artists like Michelangelo and Raphael and Da Vinci and others, those great Renaissance artists and others, they really had a kind of a special flavor in their drawings. They had a knack for revealing that inner core, that inner spirit of movement and energy that is infused in their drawings. And it's an interesting way that they sort of go about it. Their drawings do show their knowledge of facts, of anatomy, and understanding, their deep, keen understanding of the fundamentals of drawing. But that wasn't enough for them. They knew that more about drama and the poetry of movement and force and energy, and their drawings revealed those characteristics. Also, a lot of their drawings were practically studies for large-scale efforts like fresco paintings or sculptures, and they were relating stories of a biblical or mythological nature. And so just drawing a figure standing there on a platform holding a stick wasn't quite enough. They had to give it a bit more of a spark. And very often, I'm sure that the models had to hold poses, but a lot had to be done from their imagination. They must have had some system of setting up a model and working in parts. I would imagine letting a model rest here and there so they could hold these poses. Now, in the drawing that we'll do today, we are going to focus on some very specific things in order to kind of elicit that energy and spirit and hopefully some emotion in the drawing. Some of them are fairly practical, like the idea of contrapposto. That's just taking different segments of the body and twisting them and bending them against each other. So a rib cage slightly bent against the pelvis. And then the head bent again against the rib cage in the opposite direction. These counter positioned forms give a certain fluidity and energy to the figure, rather than a static stacking of one form on top of the other. So that's going to be an important issue. So as I arrange the pose and as Wayne takes the pose, I'm going to ask him to do certain things to forcibly move one part of the body against another, or an axis of one body against another, or even invent it or enhance it. I'll be doing a lot of that in order to engender, I think, some of that force. Another thing that we'll be using in the drawing is a lot of gesture. That is that initial sort of swirling line that moves through the figure and explains the doing of the figure, not so much reporting the facts. We are going to show the dramatic thrusts of arms and limbs and one segment of the torso against the next, and make sure to explain that with a good amount of clarity. And there's another thing that will be involved, all throughout this drawing. And that is something called pentimenti. And pentimenti is really, literally translated, sort of regrets or mistakes. There are mistakes in the drawing. And every artist is, when they start a drawing, even they put initial lines down, and they usually need to resolve those lines, reposition them. Well, the old lines that are there, they can be erased, but we're going to keep them. Some of them will on their own merge back into the drawing, melt back into the rendering through rubbing and softening and adding more lines. But others that fly out from the figure, we're going to keep those and keep those drawings, those initial sort of energetic tendrils that wind throughout the form. And so they go inside the form, these gestural lines, almost like a little circulatory system, and then just a jump, they leap out from the figure also. And those drawings, they too will show a little bit of the motion of the hand, the energy of the figure, and also if, for instance, there are pentimenti of hands or fingers, they will suggest other positions of that hand or the finger or an arm, and almost look like a little vibration, like a resonating chord on a guitar, for instance, and so it gives a bit of sparkle to the rendering, and a sensation of sort of a propulsion or movement or just that kinetic energy that we're looking for. So we want to avoid anything that appears too static. But we are going to look for any opportunity to make this figure move and twist and almost show that this is a living, breathing person. We're not drawing a cast. This is not a still life. It's much more than that. So we will get things set up, but before we do that, we'll just talk a little bit about the materials. Most of the materials that we use here are very similar to 3-colored chalk and red chalk drawing that are in some of our other videos. The only difference is we're going to focus only on one tool, so we don't have to deal with juggling too many different colors or materials. And the one tool that I'll be using probably 95% of the time is this pencil right here. This is a black colored pencil. It's a very thin pencil. And the color pencil, which has the waxy binder, the paper has to be treated just so in order to allow this to look like charcoal, like hard compressed charcoal or Conte. So that's fairly important. Otherwise, I won't be able to layer and layer the drawing. I'm going to be letting lots of layers of line and tone values on top of this drawing in order to build up some dimensionality in the picture. This pencil does not let you do that on regular paper very easily. So I need to treat the paper with first a little bit of watercolor to make it look good, and then a little bit of extra sizing on it, and I'll be using shellac for that. And again, that's something you'll be able to see in the materials segment of this DVD. But this instrument right here, this is what we'll be using. Sometimes our finger, sometimes a brush. We'll be using all of these things in order to get a fairly solid image down that hopefully will seem as if it will have a little bit of life to it. So we're ready to start this drawing now, and we spent a good amount of time arranging the model in an animated, energetic pose that will really convey this idea of the dynamic figure. Now we also stabilize the pose too, and with props because this is going to take several hours working on this drawing, and we don't want to torture our models, so we made sure that we had chairs and fabrics and things like that. So periodically, he can rest certain parts of his body. But the first part of this pose, he's going to take this pose exactly as I sort of envision it for the drawing. I don't want this to look like a model standing up on a platform, on the model platform for several hours, trying to hold a pose. I want this to look like a moment in time. Now also, I've thought ahead a little bit about what I'd like to do with this drawing and with the pose, and very likely I'll have dual images on the page, sort of a bit of a reverberation of the figure. And so I have two poses in mind that we'll play around with. And when I start this gesture, which is the first sort of exploration of the idea of the doing of this pose, I will probably just focus only on one and then move to the other. But who knows, we might just, this whole enterprise of drawing the figure in action, everything is in flux. And so there is no absolute standard that I ever use, but and things occur to me as I'm drawing. So it's always interesting for me. It's never exactly the same. So there'll be little shifts that I'll ask Wayne, our model, to take. But for the most part, the pose is, it was fantastic. I don't think I'll have to do too much. He just has this knack for taking a pose that's sort of in my head. And so that's why I use him so much, and why he's perfect for this project right here. So I've got my black chalk, the very thin pencil, that is with the paper prepared, and this pencil I'll easily be able to kind of brush away if a line isn't quite right, or I want to soften it or adjust it, and kind of work it back into the page, and it turns into a mid-tone that I can erase a little bit later. The first lines, just like any drawing, even a static portrait or a still life, they're always just going to have some kind of thrust or movement to it. So I'm going to try to get the feeling of the main axis lines of the figure with these first lines. I think we're ready to go now. Okay, Wayne's here on the pose, and I'm going to go from the head down to the foot, like that, and bring out the arm that way too. And then get a spot also for where the bottom of the foot and the head will be, because I want to try to get the whole figure into this space, and then leave this area here for the other figure. From here, I'm going to put the rib cage in that way, and find a base, kind of a midpoint for the body, and then begin to, around these areas, there's the rib cage, gesture the figure. So here are my first curves that I put in. I use curves in the very beginning and the end, and not much in between. So I would say 80 to 90% of the drawing are mostly a lot of little angles that I'll put into the rendering. Here's a very strong axis there for the turn of the lumbar region into the square of the pelvis. At this point, I want to make sure that I've got enough room here. If for some reason I lose a foot, it's not the end of the world. I could always let it reappear somewhere else on the page. That's perfectly fine to create little satellite images. But I'm going to try to get the whole figure in right here.